This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I give my picks for the worst cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at Magic's worst combat tricks. I've already looked at the game's best combat tricks in this series, so it makes sense for us to now take a look at the worst ones. In Magic, a combat trick is an instant that can enhance one or more of your creatures during combat. Generally, when you cast one, the goal is to allow your creature to survive combat while making sure your opponent's creature dies. They also have the upside of allowing you to buff a creature so it can do lethal damage in a situation where your opponent doesn't block. Combat tricks have some significant disadvantages though, namely that your opponent responding to you using one can utterly blow you out with a 2-for-1. But the upside that the best combat tricks offer is worth the risk. The best combat tricks give you a big boost for a low cost, thus they can give you some serious tempo when your creature is able to run over an opposing one. However, this means that there are many bad combat tricks out there because most of them do not deliver the necessary efficiency or power to overcome their inherent shortcomings. The cards that appear in this list and the order in which they appear is based on my own opinion, but there are some requirements for a card to end up on my worst lists. It has to be bad in all three of Magic's play modes: 60 card constructed, commander, and limited. It also has to have been bad for all of Magic's history. In other words, these cards are terrible in every format and they've always been bad. I think those are some pretty necessary criteria if we're going to consider these cards some of the worst ones ever printed. Alright, let's take a look at my picks for Magic's 10 worst combat tricks. At number 10, it is Glyph of Destruction. This 1-mana instant gives a blocking wall you control +10/+0 and prevents all damage that would be done to it. Then you destroy that wall at the beginning of the next end step. +10/+0 is an impressive boost for 1 mana. It's enough to allow your creature to kill an opposing creature in combat almost every single time, but there are two big problems with Glyph of Destruction. First, it is incredibly narrow, since it's only capable of targeting a blocking wall. If that was this card's only problem, it probably wouldn't be here, but the glyph also almost always causes you to go down cards, since your wall dies at the beginning of the next end step no matter what. So yeah, your wall may successfully kill something that it's blocking, but then by the end of your turn, you've used up the glyph and the wall. And that's pretty much the card's best case scenario. In the intro, I noted that the risk of a 2-for-1 is one of the big problems with tricks, so it's a huge problem that this one pretty much always makes sure that happens to you. The only cool thing you can do with this is combine it with a fling effect, but it takes too much setup and is too narrow for that to be something you really want to attempt. At number 9, it is Fanatical Fever. This 4-mana instant gives your creature +3/+0 and trample until end of turn. The ideal situation for this card is to use it on a huge creature that just got chump blocked. When that happens, you get to run that creature over and do some significant damage to your opponent. That's pretty much the ideal scenario for the card, and obviously it doesn't always go that way. For a combat trick to be worth it, it normally has to have a good chance of allowing your creature to not only kill an opposing creature, you also want it to be capable of keeping your creature alive in a combat it wouldn't have won otherwise. With a +0 toughness boost, this just doesn't get there, so just like the glyph, this often results in a pretty bad 2-for-1, even if you do manage to kill an opposing creature and chip in for some damage. You end up spending a ton of mana for this weak effect too. At number 8, it is Wicked Reward. This 2-mana instant gives your creature +4/+2, but you also have to sacrifice a creature as an additional cost to cast it. The way this card was originally templated, it does sort of seem like you can sacrifice as many creatures as you want and get that boost every time, in which case this would be an awesome card that could allow you to do a ton of damage out of nowhere while also letting you sacrifice a bunch of stuff for value, but unfortunately that isn't how it works. You can only sacrifice a single creature, and you can only get the boost once. And that's a pretty bad card. +4/+2 is a pretty solid boost for the cost, but the fact you also have to have some other creature around just to cast this is a pretty big problem, one that restricts just how easy to cast and how effective it can be. You have to sacrifice something that makes for good fodder, otherwise this is another trick that instantly results in you 2-for-1ing yourself. Also, if your opponent can interact in any way when you cast this, your worst case scenario is a 3-for-1, and that's brutal. If you're really desperate for some sacrifice effects, there are hundreds of less narrow, less risky effects that allow you to sacrifice creatures, so it isn't like this is the type of card you're really looking for when you build your sacrifice deck. Sacrifice is a really popular theme in EDH, and this card still doesn't see much play. At number 7, it is Flowstone Strike. This 2-mana instant gives a creature +1/-1 and gives that creature haste until end of turn. This combat trick has a little more flexibility than some of the others on the list. It can actually be used as a removal spell that can take down a 1 toughness creature, and you can cast it before combat to give a creature haste. But that's also part of what makes this card so awkward. Actually, using it as a trick means you don't get all the value out of the card you can otherwise get by casting it in your first main phase. And if you're just casting this to give something haste or maybe to kill a 1 toughness creature, you're still getting a really underwhelming effect for the mana cost. And the fact is that if you want to use this to benefit your creature in combat, you're also very awkwardly increasing its chances of dying in combat, which is pretty much the exact opposite of what you actually want to be doing with combat tricks. At number 6, it is Yar. This 3-mana combat trick gives a creature controlled by a defending player +3/+0 and allows it to block up to 2 additional creatures each turn. The first problem with this card is simply that it's too narrow. It can only be used if the creature you target is controlled by a player who is being attacked. Tricks that only work on defense are collectively pretty awful, and not just because they are more narrow than other tricks. Another major problem is that using tricks defensively tends to be far riskier. This is because your opponent is much more likely to have all of their mana available when they're attacking you than they are when you're the one attacking them. So the risk for a 2-for-1 is even higher than normal. Sometimes you do have to use a trick defensively in a pinch, but a trick that is only useful when you're being attacked is really bad news. I could maybe live with those problems if this did something that was actually powerful, but it just doesn't. It's another trick that completely lacks a toughness boost, so if your creature was going to die in combat anyway, it's still going to die in combat. Sometimes you may be able to manufacture a situation where you cast this and block 3 creatures and kill all of those creatures, but that's still just going to be a 3-for-2, and that's the extremely fragile best case scenario. At number 5, I have Unnerving Assault. If you spend both blue and red mana to cast this, you give your opponent's whole board -1/-0, and your whole board +1/+0. Even if it did both of those things all the time without this mana requirement, it wouldn't be very good. This is because there are better ways to pump your whole board and way better ways to weaken your opponent's board, and there just aren't enough situations where casting this will actually do something. You'll just use it up to maybe save some creatures in combat or do some extra damage or prevent a bit of damage. Very rarely will it let you actually kill something and allow you to trade card for card with your opponent. And there's not really a reason to play a card like this unless it has a super powerful effect, and this just doesn't. At number 4, I have Barreling Attack. This 4-mana instant gives a creature trample and gives that creature +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature that blocks it. So typically, that means you pay 4 mana to get +1/+1 in trample, and that is a horrendous rate. Sure, you can think of situations where your opponent puts a ton of blockers in front of your creature, but even if that happens, +1/+1 for each of those creatures isn't usually going to result in your creature actually successfully killing all of those creatures and surviving, unless all of those creatures happen to be 1/1s. The trick is almost entirely useless in situations where your opponent doesn't block too, further restricting how useful or effective this card can be. While using a trick to do more damage isn't typically optimal, the fact that they have that upside definitely matters, and this one doesn't, in addition to the fact that it's just horrible at helping your creature out of a bad situation. At number 3, it is Rapid Fire. This trick gives First Strike and Rampage 2 to a creature. Rampage is a fairly obscure mechanic, so I'll tell you what it does. It gives your creature a stats boost for each creature beyond the first that blocks your creature. So Rampage 2 means you get +2/+2 for each blocker beyond the first. At first, this card might not seem that bad. I mean, in a situation where your creature gets blocked by more than one thing, First Strike combined with Rampage will wreck your opponent. Sure, it's narrow, but that still feels like more upside than most of the cards on this list, right? Well, that would be true, but this card has one massive problem. You can't actually cast it after your opponent declares how they're going to block. Instead, you have to do it before blocks, and that is a huge problem because like Barreling Attack, this trick does stone nothing in situations where your opponent doesn't block, and they won't be, since they know things will go super bad if they do. You could combine this with a Lure Effect for a hilarious result, however, that's significant setup to make this card actually do something. Most of the time, this card will feel like you're paying 4 mana for nothing, and I would recommend against that. At number 2, I have Rustic Shield. This gives +0/+1 to your whole board, and it gives an additional +0/+2 unless any player pays 2 generic mana. In other words, if no one pays the tax here, your whole board gets +0, +3. So let's imagine that this always gave your board +0, +3. Would that be a good card? Nope. I may have been complaining in this video about how tricks that don't give a toughness boost are a problem, but also not granting a power boost really limits how useful a card can actually be. You really need a power boost and a toughness boost for a trick to be effective, as it means there are a wider variety of situations where the trick can help your creature successfully win in combat. If you're just boosting toughness, this is going to basically be a bad version of a fog effect, and that's if everything really goes your way. When someone at the table decides to pay this tax, this card becomes absolutely putrid too, as +0, +1 is going to be even worse. And at number 1, I've got Battle Cry. This 3-mana instant untaps all of your white creatures, and whenever a creature blocks that turn, it gets +0, +1. This makes Rustic Study look like mutagenic growth. The max boost this will give you is +0, +1, and it costs 1 more mana than Rustic Shield. Sure, it also happens to untap all of your white creatures, but the limited boost plus that effect generally means that this is going to be another glorified fog effect, one that's too narrow to ever be useful. At least with Rustic Shield, it can buff your creatures whenever you want, meaning it can be used to help them survive damage from removal spells and the like. You can also use the shield even if you're the attacker, and that sometimes may actually be useful. Battlecry only giving the boost once your creatures block, so in other words it's completely useless in all other situations, is a problem. Basically, this only does one thing. It makes your creatures infinitesimally better at blocking. So it's not only super underpowered, it's also incredibly narrow, and I think that's what makes it the worst combat trick in Magic. So those are my picks for the 10 worst combat tricks in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards because, I don't know, maybe you like losing, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.